Well, we live in a post-colonial era, and this is, we've seen the end of colonialism, although there are still plenty of remnants of colonialism in a couple of different ways. And this is very important in understanding some of what's going on in many predominantly Muslim countries, I think. If you go back, think in longer terms, and I don't have a whole lecture here to give, or I do, but I don't have time for it. When you look at the history of Islam, as I briefly mentioned before, you have this phenomenal civilizational system, religious, economic, political, social system that develops, that literally dominates the world for many centuries and influences and shapes world history dramatically. But like all great civilizational systems, it began a period of uneven decline. And with the rise of Europe and the Renaissance and so forth, you begin to get a decline, as you've had with all great empires. And you still have the Ottoman Empire, in the Turkey area, Turkey and beyond. You have the Safavid dynasty in Persia, the Mughal dynasty in Italy. So you still have these remnants of great Islamic civilization and empire, but those eventually all become under the control of Western European colonial powers. For a couple of centuries, you've got the British and the Portuguese and the French, ruling the Dutch, the rest of the world.
Right. Which was not spread by the sword. They just came peacefully.
They did. And so, of course.
Gotta put that.
Well, with the end of the colonial era and in the 20th century, particularly after World War I, we have the beginning of the system that we now embrace, which is the rise of the nation-state system. And the theory, at least, is that the nation-states are run by indigenous people that, and we've all seen the movie Gandhi. And so, finally the British are out and the Indians get to have their own. Well, there's a lot of debate about what's that mean and where do we draw the lines. And some people want a Muslim state that's called Pakistan and others don't. And, so there are tremendous problems in the post-colonial era. And much of the legacy, I would say, that we're dealing with right now still relates to a history of domination, a history of economic exploitation, artificial borders that were drawn by departing colonial powers in ways that served their own economic and political and military interests. Read the history of Iran, the British involvement and the U.S. involvement in Iran. All the Shah's Men is a great book by Stephen Kinzer that ought to be required reading for everybody in Congress to see the history of U.S. and British involvement in Iran and the overthrow and the return of the Shah and the overthrow of Mossadegh in 1953. Well, this isn't just ancient history. This is very relevant. This is post-colonialism dramatically depicted, and why there's a lot of suspicion and fear of superpower continuing that kind of colonial domination. And you even hear echoes of this. I know I'm being a little truncated because this is a big topic, but you hear echoes of this with what's going on, say, in Egypt. So much of the debate we're hearing on TV is, well, what should we do? What should we tell them? As though somehow we're the boss of the world, that it's up to us to tell the people in Egypt. Well, that's classic colonial thinking. The old joke, the U.S. sneezes and the rest of the world catches a cold. Well, that's the legacy of colonialism. These are nation states, but in many places, as we're seeing, most people are now seeing more clearly, the people who have been running these states have been monarchies or military dictatorships or autocrats of one sort or another, who may or may not represent the indigenous will of the people. In many cases, they have not. And so we're seeing still the sort of growing pangs of the nation-state system and the possibility of a birth of some real indigenous leadership, some of which will take forms that may not be very favorable towards the United States. But democracy is a messy business.
It is. Speak to
that. He said it beautifully. I just might add, the neo-colonial governments that people perceive now are people perceive those governments like the government of Egypt and Tunisia and so on and so forth as a post-colonial government that was a puppet government for the original colonial forces. So people in the Middle East perceive that, and which puts the United States in a very, very tough situation. It's a matter of now principle versus interest, and I think looks like we're going to be standing for principle in those regions. So the Middle East have gone through, or the Muslim world have gone through a history that is unfolding within our frame of mind right now. Things that are happening right now really is a remnants of colonial era. I've written a paper the other day. Is if the Muslim would have stayed a superpower back then, without the colonial power, pretty much would have been a form and a foundation very similar to the United States of America, with a federation and a Supreme Court and state courts and so on and so forth, because that is really what the Islamic teachings are. That's why many Muslims in the Middle East look upon the United States as could have been our model, and look for democracy as a model to run their countries with.